The Face in the Glass by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Read by Bethina.
Part 1. The Warning. In far distant Yorkshire, many years ago, stood an old manor house, a grey, grim building surrounding an open courtyard, in the middle of which played a melancholy fountain. The house was close to the wide moors that stretch away to the city of York, and beside the village there was not another place within miles. Except for the housekeeper and the usual staff of servants, the house had been uninhabited now for some time, for the late owner had been a great traveller and had been drowned during his last voyage, close to home too, which made it all the sadder, and he was brought back to be buried in the dreary family vault one day in the spring before my story opens. Since that occurrence, the housekeeper declared that, whenever there were storms out at sea, the wind used to howl and wail down the long passages like a soul in pain, and that a dreadful sound of dripping water always was to be heard in the room where the poor body was laid, in the interval before the funeral. There were also some mysterious chambers in the mansion where the doors disappeared periodically. An entrance to them was thereby prevented for months together, and when they were at last restored, the walls were found adorned with diabolical sketches of fiends, and the furniture would be arranged in anything but an artistic manner. However, this did not seem to weigh very heavily on the spirits of the new owners. Mr. and Mrs. Munro, a high-spirited, courageous couple who had not long been married and were as happy as the day was long. Mrs. Munro, indeed, professed herself most anxious to see one of those wonderful ghosts, but then she was strong-minded and actually thought nothing of going to bed alone in the dark, and she would visit the haunted chambers and walk about the passages at night until the servants almost believed she must be a ghost herself. So extremely fearless was she on the subject. Nor was her husband in any way behindhand in assisting her in her ghost hunts. But he was out a great deal hunting and shooting just then, and often came home simply to dine and fall asleep, sometimes even over the dinner table itself, with sheer fatigue. Mrs. Munro had been one of a large family who lived in a cheerful house in sunny Kent, and had had very little time there for the reading, writing, and walking with which she now filled up her days in the most satisfactory manner, and she had not yet found the time hang heavily on her hands. But still she was not very sorry when the first hard frosts of the rigorous Yorkshire winter bound up the ground into an iron mass and put a stop to the outdoor amusements which took her husband so constantly away from her side. Occasional falls of snow, too, rather spoiled his shooting, and he could only putter about the house, farm, and the little park, getting an occasional seabird that was driven in from the coast, and that gave him an evening's work, looking it out in one of his numerous Bewick illustrated books, for as he never could find it there, the occupation was as endless as it was enthralling. This was very well for the first fortnight or so, and Mrs. Munro could go out with him to look for the birds, and could help him with his Bewick at night. But at last the snow began to fall in earnest, and after 4 days of it, with scarcely a break in the chilly grey sky, when the post had never come in at all, and the one newspaper of the week had never been delivered, Mrs. Munro was beginning to wonder if it would be wicked to pray for a thaw, for she foresaw that unless something new could be contrived in the way of amusement for her lord and master, she would discover what having too much of a good thing was like. For even her company had begun to pall, and he became first fidgety, next complaining, then fractious about his dinner, and then very, very cross. At last a bright idea struck her. "Hugh," she said, "let us get Betty's keys from her this very moment and go in for a regular ghost hunt. The evening has come on very rapidly, and the moon on the snow will make the rooms as bright as day. See," she added, drawing apart the heavy crimson curtains that hung over the deep, small paned windows. "The clouds are all gone, and tomorrow you may be able to shoot again, and we may never have such a glorious opportunity for months to come, so don't let us miss it. We're both tired of sitting over the fire, and a rush through all those mysterious rooms above our bedroom floor will give us an appetite for dinner, even if we are not rewarded by the sight of the much-to-be-desired bogey." "It will be horribly cold," answered Hugh, shrugging up his shoulders and stretching out his hands to the big fire that blazed up the chimney. "And besides, if we did see a ghost, it would be the death of you. You know it's only because you didn't believe in Betty's stories that you are so courageous." "My dear Hugh," said Ruth impressively, "I don't for one moment believe we shall see anything worse than ourselves, as old nurse used to say. But if we did, what could possibly happen to us? I have been up and about all hours of the night, especially when Betty was so ill the week before last, and really, if there were anything to be seen, I should have seen it then. However, I won't go now if you don't like it." "Oh, we'll go," answered Hugh. "I was rather lazy, that's all." And so saying, he rang the bell and ordered the keys, and after a little delay, a goodly assortment of all sizes and species of key was brought them, and off started Mr. and Mrs. Munro on their ghost hunt. Hugh's spirits rose with the search, and they went upstairs and downstairs, unlocking many a cupboard and room that had not been looked at for months, and maybe years, but not a ghost was to be seen. Every now and then a most suggestive rustle was to be heard amongst the dusty hangings of the oak four posters, and Hugh and Ruth held each other's hands a little tighter than usual. But on investigation it turned out to be either the wind that was beginning to rise, or a shimmer from the lamp they carried showed them a little grey mouse scuttling away under the beds. Now and then, too, a dreary groan seemed to pierce the darkness as they opened some heavy door, but this too generally turned out to be caused by the rustiness of the hinges. They were getting gradually in extremely high spirits, and as the hunt proceeded and nothing was found, they were laughing and talking loudly, when suddenly they came upon a door at the very end of the passage that led down to the inhabited portion of the house, which they had not noticed before. Of course it was locked, and they discovered at once, and after trying to unlock it with every key they had, they came to the conclusion that they would have to go downstairs after one that would fit the lock, when suddenly the wind seemed to rise yet higher, and a rather strong puff came through the keyhole, through which Mrs. Munro was peeping to see if the key had been left there, extinguishing the lamp she held, and they were at once plunged in darkness. However, Mr. Munro soon lighted it again. "The windows must all be open," said he, "in which case it was quite time we investigated our domain. I dare say old Betty has lost the key, and is afraid I shall scold her for her carelessness. However, if you aren't frightened, Ruth," he added, turning to his wife, "I'll run down and ask her about it, if she's lost it. I'll have the door broken open and those windows shut, for there's wind enough here for a ship in full sail." "Yes, do," answered Mrs. Munro brightly. "Doubtless here's the sailor's ghost that makes our nights so extremely squally when the wind is high, and if we can get rid of him, perhaps I shall not be driven to have a new maid every time the wind blows from the north-west, which is beginning to be rather a trouble, especially now when the snow is so deep. I should never get one out from York." "Well, wait there, then," said Mr. Munro, and he hurried off into the downstairs regions and asked the old housekeeper for the missing key. She rose from her seat by the fire, trembling, and in a hurried manner said, "Now don't he, Master Hugh?" "Don't he?" repeated Hugh scornfully. "Don't he what? If you've lost the key, what does it matter? We'll soon get a new one, but if you haven't, and it's any of your superstitious nonsense, you ought to know better than to try on any of that with us. Be quick, too, for it's mighty cold up there, The windows are open, I think, and though the night is still, the wind seems to chill one through. Master Hugh, said Betty impressively, in that room has lain dead many members of the Munro family. Somehow or other, every member has either died there or been carried thither in his coffin to wait for his funeral day. And tonight, Master Hugh, she added, waxing more eloquent as her dread of his taking the key increased, tonight is the anniversary of the day Master Charles was brought there, drowned and dead from Flamborough Bay. And you know that as sure as you go into that room, so sure will you see reflected in the glass the face of any member of the family who has to die before the year is out. And on the bed, Master Hugh, you'll see the coffin with its dreadful drip, drip, drip from the shroud of the poor dead boy, just as it dripped ceaselessly with sea-water when they had buried him out of our sight. What on earth are you about, Hugh? Broke in a voice from the doorway. I am nearly frozen to death, and I want to get into the room. Give me the key, Betty, said Hugh. I'll run the risk of the ghosts, coffin and all, and besides, we are ghost hunting. So, my dear, he went on, turning to his wife, who, tired of waiting, had come down to see what he was doing, according to Betty, we may cry Eureka, for the ghost is found. And laughing very much, the two young people took the key from Betty's unwilling hand, and rushing up the wide oak staircase, they were soon at the door of the ghost chamber. The wind seemed to have risen in their short absence, and as they rested for a moment after their hurried race up the stairs, there seemed to come to them the regular drip, drip, drip that old Betty had prophesied. Even their stout hearts quailed somewhat, but with an impatient imagination, of course, Hugh turned the key in the lock and the door came open. Only a bare boarded chamber, and in the middle the bed that had held so many, many corpses. 3 tiny windows, all close-shuttered, but through the chinks came stray moonbeams, and a most tremendous rush of wind that agitated the light chintz hangings to the bed, until all sorts and shapes of figures seemed in the folds, peeping and glaring at the newcomers. Between each window was hung a looking-glass, and above the mantelpiece was another. Other furniture there was none. "The window must be broken," said Mrs. Munro, and so saying she advanced to throw open the shutters, which she had no sooner done than she was alarmed by hearing her husband fall with a loud bang behind her, with the muttered exclamation, "My God!" Ruth tore to the bell and rang a tremendous peal, and before the servants came rushing up she had dragged Hugh into her arms, and regardless of any ghost that might be about, turned all her attention to her husband, wishing heartily that she could get at some of the water she heard continually dripping near her. Just as the servants reached her, she caught sight of a thin stream of water meandering towards them, making a line of light through the dust, and she stooped forward to dip her handkerchief into it when Betty, who, notwithstanding her age, was the first to answer the summons she had been awaiting breathlessly ever since the key had left her hands, rushed forwards, and with a "Missus, that's corpse water!" deluged Hugh and Ruth with the contents of a jug she had brought up with her, convinced that it would be required. Hugh was carried out of the room into his own, and just as Ruth turned to lock the door, she saw, or fancied she saw, in the moonlight that now flooded the room, the pale shadow of a coffin on the bed, from which proceeded the thin stream of water which she had so nearly used for her husband, and with a shudder of horror, but with a promise to herself to reinvestigate the subject, she closed and locked the door, slipping the key into her pocket, and followed Hugh into his room. By this time he had come to himself, and was beginning to wonder what on earth had been the matter, but the moment he saw his wife, the remembrance of the horror came back to him, and he nearly fainted again. When he was all right once more, which was not until the next day, and they were seated at a late breakfast, Ruth implored him to tell her quietly and calmly all he had seen. But all she could draw from him was the assurance that no power on earth should induce him to tell her, and that he wished to forget all about it as soon as he could. Ghosts? Oh, ghosts were nonsense, of course, but still there was no need to talk of them. But Hugh, said Ruth mysteriously, I saw it too. And I didn't mind a bit. After all, she added, alarmed at the expression on her husband's face, it might have been only a leak in the roof that allowed the water to come in. And moonbeams do take such curious shapes, especially when reflected from the snow, that I believe the coffin only existed in our imagination, and I shall go up again tonight and see the matter straight once and for all. If there really should be a ghost, well, we must use all our endeavours to lay the perturbed spirit. But if there isn't, we had surely better discover that it is so, for really you look white and ready to faint at the mere idea of it. You must do nothing of the kind, answered Hugh decidedly. I saw neither the coffin nor the water, and what I did see was probably nothing of any consequence, but I cannot mention it to you, of all people under the sun. At all events, not until the first shock has worn off. And I must ask you to give up any ideas you may have of going there again. Before Ruth had any time to either give him the desired promise or argue him out of his absurd superstition, as she characterised his ideas in her own mind, Hugh had caught sight of the weekly postman labouring at last through the melting mud in the avenue, and doubtless wishing to forget all about the affair of the night before he went out to meet him. Very sorry, sir, said the postman, to be late, but still more sorry to be the bearer of bad news. Your poor brother's heart broke. He've lost his missus, and he wants to see you at once. The funeral's tomorrow, and he does hope the roads will be open enough to allow of you to come to him, for he's terribly cut up about it. Hugh took the letters and went in, and who shall say how thankful he was at the bad news, for he had fully believed that he had seen his wife's face in the glass in the ghost room last night, and now it had turned out, so he thinks, to be that of his younger brother's wife, who was his wife's sister, and who resembled Ruth greatly. In his joy at the load lifted off his mind, he almost forgot he had to tell his wife of her sister's death, and he was glad to find her absent on household duties, where she remained until he had read his letters, and felt a more saddened frame of mind. Poor Ruth was in so much trouble, and at the same time in such a bustle to get her husband and his groom and garments off in time, that the ghost quite slipped both their minds, and it was only when he was halfway to York and had got out onto the open moor, where the snow was rapidly melting under a warm north-west rain, that Hugh wished he had told Ruth all about it, and had asked her to give him the promise he wished for in the morning. And so he jogged on until the 45 miles of damp, cold riding were over, and he found himself entering the dark, narrow streets of York. Part 2. The Fulfilment. After the first sad questions and answers had passed between Mr. Munro and his brother Edgar, Hugh proceeded to tell how alarmed he had been in the ghost chamber the night before by the apparition in the glass. Edgar looked up from his seat by the fire and said, "What time did you see it, Hugh?" "I can't in the least tell," answered Hugh, "but I should say about 6 or a little after. But what does that matter? The warning was conveyed to me, if only I had not at once jumped to the conclusion that it must be Ruth." "Mary died the day before yesterday," said Edgar. "She was sitting there looking at me as well as you are, and all of a sudden she fell forward and must have died instantly. Thank God," he added in broken accents. "She never suffered at all. Dr. Borcham told me that her death was instantaneous, and it's just as her father died too. It must be in the family." "God forbid!" exclaimed Hugh, jumping up. "Don't, for heaven's sake, talk like that. Mary and Ruth are sisters, remember. Think of what you are saying." "I could never see why we pray against sudden death," said Edgar, still in the same quiet tone of voice. "Think how mercifully one glides out of all the turmoil and pain of this mortal life into perfect rest. Would I could lie down at once by Mary's side and sleep too." "Merciful for those who go," said Hugh, "but not for those that remain behind. Think of the shock! But it is getting late, and I have had a long ride. I must go to bed." And bidding his brother good night, he went up the staircase into the room appointed for him. Just across the narrow passage was that other quiet room, in which lay the body of his sister-in-law, under the doorway of which came a thin line of light and subdued murmur of talk that showed someone was still in the room with her. Hugh had not seen her since the day on which the two brothers and sisters had been married. He took up his candle again, and going across the passage, knocked at the door. It was opened about an inch by the old family nurse who had come to live with Mary on her marriage, and she, seeing who it was, came out, and shutting the door carefully behind her, drew Hugh back again into his own room, and shut that door too. "Now, Mr. Munro," said she, "I know what you want, but listen to me, and don't ask to see poor Miss Mary again. You would far better remember her as she was that last time you saw her, a bonny, happy bride, than take away in your mind how she looks now. And besides," she added, "she is so like dear Miss Ruth that I am sure you should not look at her. It can do her no good now, poor lamb, and may give you a shock you will not easily get over. And you look white and tired enough now, too." "All right, Povis," answered Hugh. "Perhaps you are right, but I thought Mr. Edgar might feel hurt. Anyhow, I leave it to you to explain matters, and as I really am almost done up, I'll take your advice. So good night." And the old nurse, having gone back to her melancholy task of watching by the coffin, Hugh proceeded to hurry into bed. As he was seated on the side of his bed, divesting himself of his garments, he happened to catch sight of himself in the looking-glass, and there, looking as if it were over his shoulder, was the dreadful face of the night before. This time the eyes were opened and seemed to look in an imploring and appealing manner into his own, as if urging some action upon him. Only the face was to be seen, as if the head were cut off at the neck, or as if the head and body were enveloped in a grey fog, out of which loomed the fair, appealing features of his wife. For that it was his wife, Hugh never thought of doubting. He rose and hurried forward to the glass, but as he advanced, the face gradually vanished, and although he stood for some time trembling and looking in all directions, it did not come again. So, putting it down in his own mind to imagination, he hastened to get into bed, and being dreadfully tired, soon fell fast asleep. The morning found himself rested, and his intellect clear and alert. He rose and dressed, but when he was brushing his hair in the glass, a cold wind seemed to pass over him. The brushes were poised in mid-air, and there, looking again at him over his shoulders, the sad grey eyes meeting his, was the face of his wife. This time more of the figure became visible as he looked, and as he stared helplessly into the eyes before him, a hand was raised, and on one finger he saw their betrothal ring shine, the curious old ring by which all the eldest sons of the Munro family have been betrothed since time immemorial. "What do you wish?" asked Hugh in a curious, hard voice that sounded weird and far off to his own ears. "What do you want?" The pale lips opened as if to speak. No words came from them. But in the room echoed, like the strains of distant music brought from far off on a soft breeze, the words, "Too late, too late," and then the vision vanished. Utterly miserable, utterly unstrung, Hugh finished his dressing and hurried downstairs to his brother, who sat in almost the same attitude and place where he had left him last night, looking haggard and miserable in the pale light that struggled in at the closed blinds. He started up when he saw Hugh and asked him what was the matter. Hugh told him the whole story and ended by saying he must order his horse and go home at once. "You cannot leave me like this," urged Edgar, "just for a vision or a dream, or what was most likely your own tired brain playing you a trick. You have not recovered the first shock, and then dear Mary's death harrowed you again. Please believe me, it is only your fancy. And what can have happened to Ruth since 10 o'clock yesterday morning? I shall never get over this terrible day without you, and I do beg and implore of you to remain till tomorrow at least, when I shall be thankful to ride back with you and remain for a little time." Hugh still persisted in his desire to go home at once, but Edgar used so many entreaties, and at last wept in the dreadful manner that men shed tears, and so he felt obliged to give in. And what with making all arrangements and going to and from the churchyard and consoling and comforting his brother during the trying ceremony, the day went quickly by, and evening found them sitting again over the dining-room fire. Hugh had gone into his room several times in the course of the day, and each time had gazed with a shuddering horror at the glass, but he had never seen the face again, and he was beginning to think that, the night once over, and his ride fairly begun towards home, he could then afford to laugh at superstition and all such follies, when a low, curious sort of moan caused both brothers to look up and listen intently. Just as Edgar was going to speak, the moan grew louder and louder, until it sounded like a tremendous wind wailing through the room. Hugh started to his feet, and just at that moment the door of the room blew open violently, and there glided in a thin grey figure that passed on silently and awfully until it reached the fireplace. The door closed after it quietly, and as Hugh and Edgar, grasping each other's hands in a clasp that was agony, advanced with slow steps towards it, a misty veil that enveloped it faded gradually and slowly away, and with a mutual shudder of horror, they recognised the figure of Ruth Munro. The wind and moaning had gradually died away, and a dreadful silence filled the room, which felt suddenly chill and damp, as if the veil of mist had faded into the atmosphere. Ruth never stirred, never took her eyes off those of her husband, into which she gazed with the same appealing glance as she had done before. Edgar's voice trembled as he spoke, but he addressed her by her name and implored her to speak to them. At the sound of his voice, the figure raised her hand, and then moving her lips, just as the face of the glass had done, words, unformed and soundless, seemed to pervade the room, but in such an indistinct manner that neither brother could make them out in the least. And on Hugh's darting forward to take the outstretched hand, the figure slowly vanished, leaving no trace of its extraordinary visit. "It's no use," ejaculated Hugh. "I shall go mad if I don't go home. Something dreadful must have happened. I shall order George and the horses and be off at once. Another night like that night, or another apparition, will be the death of me." And so saying, he rang the bell and ordered his man and the horses to be ready at once. So they started through the quiet York streets, clattering over the stones and out into the night through Micklegate Bar. The morning was beginning to struggle through the cold, thick fog that hung over the village as they drew near to the Grange, and the tired horses and men paused as they got on the bridge and gazed at the house that stood quietly among the trees. Hugh eagerly pushed his tired horse up the avenue, and hurrying up the steps rang the bell as if to wake the dead as well as the living. The door was opened at the same moment by old Betty, who was in the act of letting out the doctor, who, when he saw Mr. Munro, paused in an undecided manner on the doorstep. "For heaven's sake!" ejaculated Hugh, "my wife!" The doctor took him by the arm and led him into the dining-room. "My dear Mr. Munro," he said, "you must prepare yourself for a terrible calamity. Your dear wife has received a shock that will either kill her or result in her being out of her mind for the rest of her life. I cannot tell how or what has caused this, but Betty tells me that she was found in the death-room last night, in a state of insensibility. And since then she has been calling for you in a dreadful manner. Listen," he added, "you can hear her now." And opening the door, Hugh heard his name called in the same weird accents as those used by the figure that had visited him in York. Shaking off the doctor's detaining hand, he flew upstairs, and there, sitting up in bed and watched by the horrified maids, was his wife, calling perpetually on his name. The moment she saw him, she stopped, looked fondly at him in the same sorrowful manner that the ghost did, and then said, "I have waited for you to say good-bye. I went 3 times to see you, but I wanted you at home. There is a ghost upstairs. I saw myself laid out on that dreadful bed, and it killed me. The doctors always said any shock would, and it nearly killed you. I am only waiting to kiss you before I go." Poor Hugh threw himself on his knees and clasped her in his arms. As he did so, the eyes closed. The mouth fell into lines of infinite repose. The arms crossed themselves on Ruth's breast, and she lay back dead, as cold as marble, in her husband's presence. For days and nights Hugh lay between life and death, and it was months before he could bear to be told the whole story, months before he could hear how she was found in the old room upstairs, having gone up thither to see what had so alarmed Hugh, notwithstanding the tearful prayers of old Betty and her unspoken promise to her husband. And when he did, and when he had again visited the awful room, it was only to give orders for that part of the house to be demolished and rebuilt in such a manner that no trace whatever should remain of the death-chamber of the Munros. And it was not until another wife and 6 noisy children had been given to him that he was known to smile again. And if ever at Christmas time the conversation turned on that most enthralling topic, he would abruptly change the subject, and he never could be got to tell the story of the face in the glass. The glass itself was not destroyed, and the Munros still keep it and regard it with superstitious reverence. For as sure as there is to be a death in the family in the ensuing year, so sure on the night of All Souls is the face of the victim to be seen in the glass. At least, so tells the housekeeper, adding with her smile on her rubicund countenance, "No one tempts Providence now by going to look in the glass there, for the ghost can only be seen by a Munro, and it would be very dreadful, you know, sir, if they saw their own faces looking at them out of the glass." That was The Face in the Glass by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. I hope you enjoyed it. If so, please remember to click the like button. And if you enjoy ghost stories, particularly Victorian ones and quite obscure ones you may not have heard before, please check out the audiobook section of my YouTube channel, where you will find another story at Crichton Abbey by the same author. There are many hours of ghost stories in there if you want to amuse yourself in the dark evenings. And if you do enjoy my readings, please subscribe to the channel, or If you feel very generous, please consider becoming a channel member. It would be much appreciated. And as always, thank you for listening.